This is my true story. After my wife passed away and my life felt empty, I moved in with my son and his wife, thinking I'd spend my last years surrounded by family and love. But I was wrong. They didn't treat me like family. They treated me like trash. I ate their leftovers, slept in a corner, and prayed every night for a little respect. The worst came when my son made me sit on the floor and eat beside the dogs. That night, something inside me broke. I did something, and what followed destroyed his life completely. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I raised my son with everything I had. Every ounce of my energy, every drop of sweat, every breath I took was for him. I wasn't born rich, but I worked like a man who wanted to give his child the world. I worked in factories, lifted heavy boxes until my back gave out, walked miles to save bus fare, all so he could eat better than I did. I remember skipping meals just to make sure he had milk before school. I remember patching up my old shoes while buying him new ones. That was my joy, to see him smile, to hear him laugh, to know that maybe his life would be easier than mine. That was the only dream I ever had. When he was little, he used to cling to my arm and call me his hero. He used to say, "Dad, when I grow up, I'll buy you a big house." I believed him. I thought all the pain and struggle would be worth it in the end. But time has a cruel way of showing you who people really are. The same boy who once kissed my hand when he wanted candy grew into a man who couldn't stand the sight of me sitting at his table. Somewhere between growing up and growing cold, he forgot who I was, the man who sacrificed everything for him. It started small, like most heartbreaks do. He stopped talking to me much. He'd come home, eat, and go straight to his room. When I tried to speak, he'd grunt or ignore me. I told myself he was tired, busy, dealing with life. I convinced myself he still loved me, even if he didn't show it. I told myself it was normal for children to drift away as they grew older. I swallowed every bit of disrespect like it was my duty to stay quiet. That's what old men do, right? We stay out of the way. We don't complain. We tell ourselves they're just stressed. Then came the tone, the coldness in his voice, the impatience when I asked simple questions. Sometimes he'd snap at me for touching the remote or sitting in the wrong chair. I'd apologize, even when I didn't know what I'd done wrong. I learned to stay silent during dinner, to eat quickly, to leave the table early so I wouldn't annoy him. My daughter-in-law wasn't any kinder. She rolled her eyes when I entered a room, sighed when I asked for anything, and treated me like I was some burden they couldn't shake off. I'd hear them whispering at night. "He's useless now. We can't afford him. He's just extra weight." Those words cut deeper than any knife could. I tried to be grateful anyway. I told myself at least I had a roof over my head. At least I had family, even if they didn't want me. I told myself to ignore the pain, that love meant forgiveness. Every time my son looked at me with disgust, I remembered the little boy he used to be, the one who used to cry when I left for work. That memory kept me going, but inside, I was breaking. I could feel it, the slow cracking of my heart each time he made me feel like a stranger in my own family. There were days when they forgot to cook for me. I'd find cold rice in the pot or scraps left on a plate. I ate them without complaint. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered, because every bite reminded me that I wasn't loved anymore. I was tolerated. I was something they put up with until I was gone. I'd sit outside sometimes, with the dogs lying near me, because they were the only ones who didn't make me feel unwanted. They wagged their tails when I came out. They waited for me to feed them. They showed more affection than my own flesh and blood. That's how low I had fallen, finding comfort in the company of animals because humans had turned their backs on me. I started talking less. I smiled less. I moved slower, quieter, smaller. Like maybe if I made myself invisible, they'd stop resenting me. I told myself silence was survival. But silence was also killing me. Every day I stayed quiet, a piece of me disappeared. I had no friends, no one to talk to, no one to see the truth. From the outside, I probably looked fine, an old man living with family. But behind those closed doors, I was living a nightmare that no one could see. Still, I stayed. because I kept hoping maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe my son would remember who I was. Maybe he'd look at me with love again. But tomorrow never came. The cruelty only grew. The love I gave became the weapon they used against me. And before I knew it, my home wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage, and I was the prisoner who built it himself. The cruelty didn't come all at once. It came slowly, like a poison you don't taste until it's too late. At first, it was just his words. Sharp, cutting, careless. He'd call me useless when I forgot small things. He'd sigh loudly when I walked too slowly. "You're old," he'd say. "You can't do anything right." I'd stand there in silence, pretending it didn't hurt. But it did. Every word left a mark that nobody could see. I'd sit in my room at night, staring at the wall, trying to remember when my son's voice stopped sounding like love and started sounding like hate. Then came the shouting. It became normal for him to raise his voice, even over nothing. If I dropped a cup, if I turned the wrong light on, if I forgot to close a door, he'd explode. I used to flinch at the sound of his footsteps. My body reacted before my mind did. My hands would start shaking every time I heard him coming. My daughter-in-law joined in too, rolling her eyes, calling me the extra mouth. They made jokes about putting me in a home. I laughed with them sometimes just to make it stop, but deep down, I knew they weren't joking. The slaps started on small things. Once when I accidentally spilled tea on the table. Another time when I misplaced the remote. He'd say he didn't mean it, that I made him angry. I wanted to believe him. I told myself he was under pressure, that work was making him angry, that maybe if I behaved better, he wouldn't lose his temper. I started walking on eggshells, trying to predict his moods. Some days he was calm, quiet. Other days, his temper was a storm, waiting for me to step wrong. At meals, they started giving me cold food, sometimes scraps from the night before. If I complained, he'd snap, "You should be grateful you're even eating." I stopped complaining after that. I ate what they gave me and smiled, even when it tasted like shame. My daughter-in-law once served the dogs before she served me. I laughed weakly, pretending it was a joke, but inside, I felt my heart drop. I didn't understand how the people I loved most could make me feel less than human. Neighbors started to notice something was off. They'd see me sweeping outside late at night or sitting on the porch long after everyone went to bed a few times. They asked if I was okay. I said yes, always yes. Because how could I tell anyone that my own son was hurting me? How could I admit that the boy I raised with love now treated me like a burden? Shame kept me quiet. Fear kept me there. I thought if I left, I'd have nowhere to go. If I stayed, maybe things would get better. But they didn't. They only got worse. The first time he shoved me, it was because I forgot to turn off the light in the kitchen. My back hit the wall, and for a moment, everything went blurry. He didn't apologize. He just glared at me and went to bed. The next morning, he acted like nothing happened. I stood there, holding my ribs, pretending I was fine. But inside, I was breaking. I didn't recognize my life anymore. The house I had helped pay for, the walls I had painted, had turned into a place I feared. After that, the bruises became part of me. I learned to hide them under long sleeves. When people came over, I smiled and stayed quiet. My daughter-in-law warned me once not to embarrass the family. I nodded, swallowing the anger, swallowing the pain. Nights were the worst. They'd argue in their room, and I'd sit in mine, listening, praying they wouldn't turn that anger on me again. The sound of their laughter in the next room hurt more than the beatings, because it reminded me that they were fine, while I was not. I stopped looking in mirrors. I didn't want to see the tired man staring back. The man who had raised a son that no longer saw him as a father. I felt invisible in my own home, like a ghost walking among the living. I cooked, cleaned, kept quiet, and waited for a kindness that never came. Every day started and ended the same, in silence, in fear, in shame. But even then, even through the bruises and insults, I still tried to see my son as the boy I once held in my arms. I still hoped that one day, he'd look at me and remember Remember the man who carried him to bed when he was sick. Remember the man who skipped meals so he could eat. Remember that I was his father, not his servant, not his burden. But love alone can't change cruelty. I didn't know it then, but the worst was yet to come. That night is burned into my memory like a scar that will never fade. It was a cold evening. I remember because my hands were shaking from more than just fear. The kind of shaking that comes from an old man's bones meeting cold air and colder hearts. Dinner was late, as usual. I sat quietly in the corner, waiting, because I had learned that asking, "When are we eating?" only brought anger. When the food was finally ready, they sat at the table and ate without me. My son, his wife, and their children. I sat there listening to their laughter, their plates clinking, the smell of the food filling the room while I waited for someone to say my name. No one did. When they finished, my daughter-in-law pushed the plates away with leftovers still on them, half-eaten chicken, cold rice, and bits of bread. My son looked at me and said, "You can eat now." I stood up slowly, but before I could reach the table, he kicked one of the plates off onto the floor. The sound of it shattering made everyone go quiet for a second. Then he said it, words I'll never forget. "Eat it from there, or give it to the dogs." His wife laughed. His kids didn't say a word. I froze. I wanted to think he was joking, but his face was cold, hard, cruel. I felt my throat tighten. I stood there for a few seconds, my mind refusing to believe what I'd heard. Then he walked to the corner where the dogs were eating and pointed. "You want food, old man? Sit there." My legs gave way beneath me. I sat on the cold floor, near the dogs' bowls. They wagged their tails, not knowing any better. My son tossed a piece of stale bread toward me and said, "There, eat that. That's good enough for you." My hands trembled as I picked it up. The dogs sniffed at it too, and he laughed. The sound of that laughter will haunt me until I die. It wasn't the laugh of a son. It was the laugh of a stranger who enjoyed seeing me broken. The bread was hard. I could barely chew it. I could feel their eyes on me. His wife watching like she was enjoying a show. His children whispering to each other. My son smirking with pride. I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. Smaller than dirt. Smaller than the animals beside me. I didn't even feel human in that moment. I felt like an object. Something to mock, to control, to humiliate. My body was there, but my spirit was somewhere else, sinking deeper into a place no one could see. When I finally looked up, his wife had taken out her phone. She was recording it. My humiliation, captured like it was entertainment. My son laughed again, loud and sharp, then said, "See, Dad, the dogs like you. You fit right in." I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell him to stop, but my voice wouldn't come out. I could only sit there, tears mixing with crumbs on my face as the dogs licked the floor near me. That image, me, a father, a man who once worked 3 jobs to feed this family, now sitting beside animals, eating their scraps, that image is burned inside me. After they left the room, I stayed there for a long time. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just sat still, staring at the wall. The dogs came back and lay beside me. They were quiet, kind, simple souls. They didn't judge me. They didn't laugh. They just stayed near. I remember petting one of them with a trembling hand and whispering, "You're the only ones who treat me like I exist." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That smile, that look of satisfaction. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound I'd ever felt. I walked to the bathroom later and caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was swollen, my eyes red, my dignity gone. I touched the bruises on my arm, marks he'd left from earlier that week. That was when something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't just being hurt, I was being destroyed. Slowly, piece by piece. I whispered to myself, "Enough." Not in anger, not in rage, but in final exhaustion. I was tired of begging for kindness that wasn't coming. I was tired of being treated like less than human. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. I would stop hiding my bruises. I would stop pretending nothing was wrong. For the first time in years, I didn't care if it made him angry, because I wasn't going to die in silence. I had lived through poverty, through pain, through loss, but I would not live through humiliation again. The next morning, I picked up the phone and did something I never thought I'd have the courage to do. I called for help. That night, after he made me eat beside the dogs, I sat awake on my small bed in the corner of the living room. The whole house was quiet, but inside me, something was screaming. My body hurt from the way he'd grabbed me earlier, my arms were sore, and my heart, it felt like it had cracked open. I couldn't cry anymore. I had cried too many times before. Into my pillow, into my hands, into silence. But this time was different. This time, the tears didn't come. Only anger. Not the kind that shouts or breaks things, but the kind that burns quietly, deep and steady, like fire hidden under ashes. I stared at the ceiling and thought about my life, about all the years I spent working for him, about the nights I walked home hungry because I'd spent the last of my money on his school fees, about the time I sold my tools to buy him a bicycle, about the day I built this very house with my hands, brick by brick, dreaming it would always be a place of family and love. And now, that same house had become my prison. I looked around and realized I had nothing left. No respect, no peace, no love, just bruises, hunger, and shame. I stood up slowly and went to the mirror again, the same one I had looked into earlier. The face looking back at me wasn't a father anymore. It was a beaten man who had lost everything, even his sense of worth. My left cheek was still swollen. There was a small cut near my eye. I traced it with my finger and whispered, "This is what love gave me." That was the moment something inside me broke for good. I wasn't scared anymore. Not of him, not of what he'd do, not of what people would say. I had already lost everything that mattered, except my will to live like a human being. I sat down on the floor next to my small drawer and opened it. Inside was my old phone. I held it in my hand, staring at it for a long time. My fingers trembled, not because I was weak, but because I was deciding whether I was ready to change everything. Calling the police meant shame. It meant exposing my family. It meant the neighbors would talk, people would whisper, and my name would be dragged through the mud. But it also meant freedom. It meant I might survive. And for once, I chose survival. I didn't call that night. I wanted to, but my courage wasn't strong enough yet. I just sat there, holding the phone, my thumb hovering over the numbers, listening to my heart pound. I kept imagining his face if he found out. The anger, the shouting, the way his hand would rise before I even finished explaining myself. But then, I thought about what would happen if I didn't call one day. He'd go too far. One day, I might not wake up. And then, my silence would be the only thing left of me. That thought terrified me more than his rage. The next morning, I woke up with pain in my chest. A dull ache that wouldn't go away. I looked at my arms and saw fresh bruises where he had grabbed me the night before I lifted my shirt, and saw purple marks on my ribs. They weren't new. They were just darker now. That was when I realized how many times I'd told myself, "It's not that bad." But it was worse than I had ever allowed myself to admit. I made tea that morning like nothing was wrong. My daughter-in-law didn't look at me. My son didn't say a word. They left for work, and I was alone. That's when I went to the mirror again, one last time, and told myself, no more. I picked up the phone with both hands, took a deep breath, and dialed 3 numbers. 911. I didn't hang up this time. As I waited, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. The operator answered, and my voice shook, but I spoke anyway. I said my name, I said my age, and then I said the words I never thought I'd have the courage to say, "I want to report my son for abuse." Saying those words didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like breathing after drowning. I could feel my chest open up, my lungs fill with air for the first time in years. I wasn't just calling for help, I was calling for my life back. I hung up the phone and sat down. My hands were still trembling, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from release. I didn't know what would happen next, But I knew one thing. I would never let him make me crawl again. My silence had fed his cruelty long enough. Now, my voice would end it. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I had never called 911 in my life. I wasn't the kind of man who asked for help for years. I had handled everything on my own: hunger, loss, loneliness. But this was different. This time, it was about survival. I stared at those 3 numbers glowing on the screen and pressed call. The ringing felt endless. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop. Then I heard the voice, calm, steady, professional. 911, what's your emergency? For a second I couldn't speak. The words got stuck in my throat. My voice cracked as I finally managed to say, I want to report my son. There was silence on the other end, the kind that makes you question yourself. Then she asked softly, Sir, what did he do? My eyes filled with tears. I looked down at my arms, covered in bruises, and whispered, He hurts me. All the time. I can't live like this anymore. My voice broke, but I kept talking. I told her everything, how he shouted, how he hit me, how he made me eat beside the dogs. Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I felt shame, anger, and a strange kind of relief all at once. She asked me if I was safe. I said, He's at work. She told me to stay where I was, that officers were on their way. She asked me to gather any evidence I had, photos, anything. I hung up and sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the phone like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I felt like the walls around me were closing in and opening up at the same time. I had finally done it. I had chosen myself. After years of silence, I had spoken. I went to my small drawer and pulled out the phone I used to take pictures of my bruises. I never planned to show anyone, but some part of me must have known this day would come. I had photos of my arms, my ribs, my face. Each one told a story that no one had ever heard. I printed them at the pharmacy weeks earlier, secretly, hiding them under my old clothes. I took them out now and laid them on the table. My hands trembled as I arranged them. It was like watching my pain spread out in front of me. Physical proof of everything I had tried to deny. Minutes felt like hours. I kept looking at the door, waiting. When the knock finally came, I froze. For a second, I was scared it was him, that he had come home early and would see the phone in my hand. But then I heard a voice through the door. Sir, it's the police. I opened it slowly, and there they were, 2 officers, 1 man and 1 woman. They looked at me with concern, not pity. That mattered more than I can explain. I stepped aside and let them in. They asked me questions. I answered every one of them. They looked at the photos, wrote down notes, and examined the bruises on my arms. The woman officer's face tightened when she saw the marks. She didn't say much, but I could see it in her eyes. Anger for what had been done to me. They asked me if I had somewhere safe to go. I said no. They said, Don't worry, we'll handle it. They stayed for about an hour. They took statements, took photos, and promised they would be back that evening. I didn't know what handle it meant exactly, but I trusted them. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone believed me. Someone saw me. When they left, I sat there alone again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It was calm. It was the sound of a man who had finally spoken after years of being silenced. That evening, when my son came home, I sat in the same spot, waiting. My heart was racing, but I didn't look away when he walked in. He didn't know what was coming. He walked past me like always, mumbling something under his breath. 10 minutes later, the police car pulled up. The knock on the door came again, louder this time. He opened it, confused, still in his work clothes. The officers stepped in. "Are you Mr.?" one of them asked. He nodded, and within seconds, the tone changed. They told him he was under arrest for elder abuse. He turned toward me, his eyes wide. "What did you do?" he shouted. But I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there, hands in my lap, watching him struggle as they put the handcuffs on. For the first time, I wasn't the one shaking. He was. The same man who had made me eat beside dogs now looked like a scared child. I didn't feel hate. I didn't feel joy. I just felt done. It was over. As they led him outside, the officer looked at me and said softly, "You did the right thing." I nodded, though my throat was tight, because I knew she was right. After all those years of being silent, I had finally found my voice, and it was enough to change everything. After they took him away that night, the officers told me they would need all the proof I had, every picture, every message, every memory that could speak. When my voice shook, I spent the next morning gathering everything. I pulled out the old phone where I had hidden those photos for months, tucked away behind useless things like receipts and bills. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. The screen was cracked, the battery weak, but it still worked. Inside were pictures of bruises. My arms, my shoulders, my ribs. Some were yellow and fading, others dark purple, almost black. I took each one on nights when the pain wouldn't let me sleep, telling myself it was just for me to remember how far I'd fallen. I never imagined those pictures would one day become my defense, my proof that I wasn't just a bitter old man making stories. The officers came again in the afternoon. This time, there were 3 of them, 1 woman and 2 men. They brought a social worker too, a kind lady who spoke gently, but looked at me like she already knew the truth. They asked if they could record my statement, and I agreed. I sat at the kitchen table, my voice low, my heart pounding. I told them everything from the beginning, how the insults started, how the slaps came, how I was made to eat leftovers beside the dogs. My words came out slow, shaky at first, but the more I spoke, the easier it got. Every detail that had once been buried in shame was finally finding air. They took photos of the bruises still visible on my skin. I rolled up my sleeves and showed them the marks that hadn't healed yet. The woman officer looked away for a second, like she didn't want me to see her eyes fill with pity, but I did. It wasn't pity I needed, though. It was belief. And they gave me that. For the first time, someone was listening to me without doubt, without judgment. They weren't asking why I stayed or if I provoked him. They just let me speak. That alone felt like medicine. The social worker asked if I had anyone else, another family member, a friend, a place I could go. I said no. My voice cracked when I said it, because it was true. I had no one. Everyone I had built my life around was gone or had turned away. My son was my last piece of family, and now even that was gone. She nodded, said she understood, and told me they would help arrange a safe place for me to stay. But I didn't want to leave yet. Not until justice had begun. I wanted to face what had been hidden for too long. They asked about the neighbors. I told them about the nights they might have heard shouting, about how I sometimes swept the porch late just to stay out of the house. Later, they went around asking questions, and the truth started spilling out. One neighbor said they often heard yelling. Another said they saw me sitting outside with bruises, but didn't know what to say. One woman told them she once heard my son shouting, "You should be grateful I let you stay here." Piece by piece, everything came together. The silence that had trapped me for so long began to crumble. When they left that evening, they said they had enough evidence to move forward. They said it might take time, but the truth was clear. Now I stood by the door after they left and looked around the house. It felt strange, empty, quiet, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This time, the quiet wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with space. Space for air, space for peace, space for myself. The next few days were slow. I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying everything in my head. The look on his face when they took him away, the way his wife stayed silent, the sound of those handcuffs closing. I wasn't proud. I wasn't angry. I just felt tired. Decades of exhaustion finally settling on me like a heavy blanket. But beneath that tiredness, there was also something small and new. Something I hadn't felt in years. Dignity. A week later, the police called me back to the station. They wanted me to identify the videos they had retrieved. My daughter-in-law's phone had been seized, and inside it were recordings. ones I never knew existed. She had filmed moments of my humiliation, my pain, my silence, thinking it was funny, thinking it was harmless. They showed me one of them. I couldn't watch it all. Seeing myself on that screen, sitting on the floor, shaking beside the dogs while my son laughed. It was worse than any bruise. The officer turned it off halfway, and I asked him to delete it. He said it was evidence, and I understood. Because now, their cruelty wasn't just something I endured. It was something the world would see. That night, I lay in my bed and whispered to myself, "It's over now." For the first time in years, I believed it. The bruises would fade, but the proof, the truth, would stay. The day they arrested him was the day everything inside me went still. It wasn't peace yet, not forgiveness, not revenge, just stillness, like the air before a storm ends. That morning, the officers came again. I knew what it meant when I saw the car outside. My heart was heavy, but I didn't stop them. I sat quietly at the table, hands folded, waiting. They told me they were going to his workplace first, that they already had a warrant. I nodded. My son had always been proud of that job. He bragged about his position, his income, his house, everything he thought made him better than others. He used to say, "I made it all on my own." But that wasn't true. He built it all on my back, on my sacrifices, on my silence. And now, that silence was gone. By afternoon, I got a call from the officer. They had taken him in. He didn't resist. He was shocked at first, then angry. They said he tried to deny everything until they showed him the photos, the videos, and the statements. Then he went quiet. They said his face changed, like the weight of what he'd done finally hit him. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know what he said or if he cried. I didn't want to picture his face in that moment. Because for years, I had imagined that maybe one day he'd look at me and understand what he'd done. But understanding doesn't erase damage. It doesn't undo pain. It just comes too late. That evening, the police came to talk to me again. They told me the case was strong. The evidence was solid. The court would handle the rest. They asked me if I wanted to press full charges. I said yes. The words came out steady, clear. It felt like the first true decision I had made in decades. They left soon after, and I sat in that small kitchen, the one where so many humiliations had happened, and I just breathed. The air felt different. It didn't sting anymore. Later that night, I found myself walking through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the old photographs still hanging crooked on the wall. Everything was quiet. The dogs slept peacefully near the back door. No shouting, no footsteps, no fear. It felt unreal. I realized how much I had adjusted my entire being to survive his moods. I used to hold my breath when he was home, walk slower so the floor wouldn't creak, eat quickly so I wouldn't be seen too long. Now, for the first time, I didn't have to hide. I sat on the couch and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket. I had forgotten what peace sounded like. The next morning, the news spread. Neighbors who once looked away now came knocking. They said things like, "We had no idea," or "We're so sorry." Some meant it, some didn't. But I wasn't angry at them. I knew how easy it was to ignore suffering when it wasn't yours. My daughter-in-law disappeared that day. She packed up her things and left with the kids. I didn't try to stop her. The house felt empty after that, but it was an honest kind of empty, not the kind filled with fear. The following week, they let me attend the preliminary hearing. I didn't want to, but something in me needed to see it through. When they brought him in, he looked smaller, not in size, but in spirit. His face was pale, his eyes tired. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, it wasn't hatred I saw. It was confusion, maybe guilt, maybe fear. I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I might. There was no revenge in me. Just sadness. Sadness for the man he had become. Sadness for the years we could never get back. When the judge read out the charges, elder abuse, physical assault, coercion, he didn't speak. His lawyer did, trying to twist it, saying I was exaggerating, that I was senile. But the evidence spoke louder than words. The pictures, the videos, The neighbors' testimonies, the officer's report. There was no way out. He was taken back to custody without bail. I watched him walk out in handcuffs, head down, shoulders hunched. The same hands that had struck me were now bound. When I came home that evening, the house felt like mine again. For years, I had lived inside those walls like a stranger. Now, every corner felt familiar again. Not because the pain had vanished, but because I finally belonged there. I made myself a meal that night. Warm soup, fresh bread, nothing fancy, but it was the best meal I'd had in years. I sat at the table alone and whispered to myself, "You did it." My hands were steady, my heart calm. The man who once made me feel worthless was now facing the weight of his own cruelty. And as I finished eating, I realized something powerful. I didn't call 911 just to punish him. I did it to save myself. And that was enough. The days that followed his arrest were quiet, but they were not easy. Every morning I woke up early out of habit, expecting to hear his footsteps or his voice barking orders. But there was only silence. For the first few days, that silence felt strange, like something was missing. It wasn't peace yet. It was the echo of years of pain leaving the house slowly, like smoke after a long fire. I sat at the table each morning, sipping tea that I brewed for myself, looking around at the empty chairs where my son and his family once sat. The emptiness wasn't comforting, but it was honest. There were no lies left in the air, no fake smiles, no tension. Just truth, raw and still painful, but mine. The police came again a few times to check on me. They told me he was being held in county jail, awaiting trial. They said he wasn't talking much. They said he seemed confused, quiet. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know how he was doing. For years, I had lived thinking about how he felt, trying not to upset him, walking carefully around his anger. I was done doing that. Now, my only concern was healing. And healing, I learned, is not peace at first. It's messy, slow, and heavy. Every scar I had, inside and out, reminded me of how much I had survived. The neighbors began to visit often, bringing food, offering help. Some of them admitted they had seen signs for years, the shouting, the slammed doors, the bruises they caught glimpses of. They all said the same thing. We didn't want to interfere. I didn't blame them, but their words hurt, because that's how silence wins, not by cruelty alone, but by the comfort of those who look away. Still, I accepted their kindness now. I needed to learn how to receive care again, how to let people be good to me after so long believing I didn't deserve it. The trial began a few months later. I was there every day. My body was weak, but my will was strong. When I entered the courtroom, my heart raced. But I didn't let fear control me anymore. I sat behind the prosecution table and watched as they brought him in, dressed in a plain uniform, hands cuffed. He looked nothing like the man who had once stood tall in his own house, shouting, demanding, mocking. He looked small now, not just in stature but in spirit. The arrogance that used to fill his eyes was gone. All that remained was a hollow stare. When they read the charges out loud, elder abuse, physical assault, coercion, and neglect, I felt my chest tighten. Hearing it said out loud, with my name in the middle of those words, was both painful and powerful. The evidence was all there. The photos, the medical reports, the neighbor statements, and the recordings from his wife's phone. Every ugly truth that had been hidden inside these walls now stood in that courtroom, stripped bare. The defense tried to twist the story, saying I was confused, saying old age made me forgetful, saying I provoked him. But the prosecutor silenced all of that with one sentence. No man deserves to be treated like that, not by anyone, least of all his own son. The judge listened carefully. The witnesses spoke. The officers who visited my home testified. I sat there silent, my hands folded tightly on my knees. When my turn came to speak, I stood slowly. My legs trembled, but my voice did not. I told the court I did not want revenge. I said I wanted the truth to live somewhere outside my bruises. I said I forgave him as a father, but I wanted the world to see what cruelty looks like when it hides inside a home. My words weren't fancy, but they were real. You could feel the room go still. When the verdict came, it was guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to several years in prison. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I just lowered my head and whispered, "It's done." He looked at me once as they led him away. His lips trembled, but he said nothing. Maybe there were words he wanted to say, maybe not. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. I had already heard enough from him in my lifetime. That night, when I came home, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. The house was quiet again, but this time, it was the kind of quiet that didn't hurt. I could breathe without fear. I could sleep without nightmares. The bruises faded slowly, the pain lessened each day, but the lessons stayed. Cruelty had consequences, even when it came from family. Now, when people visit and ask if I miss him, I tell them the truth. I miss the boy he once was, not the man he became. Because the man who hurt me lost everything the day he raised his hand against the one who gave him life, and I gained something that night. Not power, not revenge, but dignity. Freedom came slowly. It didn't happen the moment they took him away or when the judge read the verdict. It came like morning light after a long, endless night, inch by inch, quiet but steady. The first night after his sentencing, I sat alone at the table and ate a warm meal I cooked myself. Nothing special, just rice, lentils, and vegetables. But it tasted different. Not because it was good, but because it was mine. I didn't have to eat quickly. I didn't have to listen for footsteps. I didn't have to hide my hunger. I ate in peace, and that peace felt heavier than any meal I'd ever had. For years, I had forgotten what it was like to breathe without fear. Every sound in the house used to make my body flinch. The sound of the front door opening, the heavy footsteps down the hallway, the sharp slam of a cupboard, all those noises had trained me to live on edge. But now, the silence wasn't a threat anymore. It was comfort. I could sit in my chair by the window, sip my tea, and not wait for someone to shout my name. I could walk freely into the kitchen, turn on the light, and not be told I was wasting electricity. It's strange how peace feels unfamiliar when you've lived too long without it. I started waking up earlier, before sunrise. I'd sit outside with the dogs, the same ones who had once shared scraps with me on the floor. They'd sit beside me quietly, heads resting on my knee. I'd stroke their fur and whisper to them like they were my old friends. In some ways, they were. They had seen my tears, heard my pain, and stayed by my side when no one else did. Now, when I fed them, it wasn't out of shame or pity. It was love, the kind that expected nothing back. The house began to feel alive again, slowly. I cleaned it, fixed the broken hinges, threw out the old torn curtains. Every time I repaired something, it felt like I was mending a piece of myself. The walls that once echoed with shouting were now filled with silence, but that silence was healing, not empty. I played music sometimes, soft and old, songs from when my wife was alive. I'd close my eyes and imagine her there, smiling, telling me that I did the right thing. That thought kept me going. Freedom wasn't only about being alone, it was about being free from fear, guilt, and humiliation. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped asking permission to breathe. For the first time in years, I didn't have to look down when I walked. I didn't have to make myself small. I could take up space, even in my own home. That realization hit me one morning when I caught my reflection in the window. I was standing tall again, my back straight. My eyes not full of shame. I looked like myself. The man I used to be before fear turned me into a shadow. People in the neighborhood began treating me differently too. Some brought meals, others invited me for tea. One of the younger men from down the street offered to help me repaint the front porch. For years, I had been invisible, and now people saw me. I didn't need their sympathy, just their acknowledgement that I was still here, still human. It felt strange, but good. The police checked in every few weeks to make sure I was doing fine. They said I could apply for victim assistance, maybe even move somewhere new if I wanted, but I didn't want to leave. This house had seen my worst days, but it also held my strength. I built it with my hands, filled it with love, lost that love, and now, piece by piece, I was rebuilding it again. I wanted to live there, not as a victim, but as the man who survived. Sometimes at night I'd think of him, my son, sitting in that cold cell. I didn't imagine him suffering. I imagined him thinking, maybe realizing what he'd done, maybe regretting it, or maybe still angry. It didn't matter anymore. His journey wasn't mine to control anymore. My duty now was to live, not to dwell. Freedom, I learned, doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means forgiving yourself for staying too long. It means promising never to lose your voice again. I wasn't sure what my future looked like, but I knew this. I would never go back to silence. Not for anyone. Not ever again. Now, when I eat dinner, I always set one extra plate. Not for him, not for anyone else, but as a reminder of the empty space I once filled with pain. It reminds me that I survived it, that I am free. It's strange how life can destroy you and then give you the pieces to rebuild yourself again. I sit now in the same house that once held my suffering, and I think about everything that has happened, not with hate, but with a kind of tired clarity. The walls no longer echo with shouting. The floors no longer shake with anger. I can walk through each room without fear. I can sit in the chair near the window and let the sun touch my face. I can hear the wind move through the trees outside without feeling trapped. It feels like I've been reborn into an old body that's learning to live again. Sometimes I catch myself remembering small things, moments that used to break me, but now just remind me of how strong I became. The way he used to slam his plate on the table, the way I used to flinch when his voice rose, the way my daughter-in-law looked at me with disgust when I spoke too long. All those memories used to feel like knives, but now they're scars, reminders that I survived what was meant to crush me. Scars don't hurt forever, they just tell the truth about where you've been. I visit the police station once in a while when they call me to sign papers or check on the case. They treat me with respect now, calling me sir, asking if I need help getting around. It feels strange, being treated gently after so many years of being treated like nothing. The officers always tell me the same thing. You were brave, but I don't feel brave, I just feel human again. I didn't call for help because I was strong. I called because I couldn't take another day of being weak. And maybe that's what courage really is. Doing what you must, even when it hurts. I've thought a lot about forgiveness. People say it heals you, but it's not as simple as that. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't make the bruises fade faster or bring back the years you lost. Forgiveness just means choosing peace over poison. I don't know if I've forgiven my son fully. Some days, I think I have. Other days, I feel the sting again when I remember his laughter that night he made me eat beside the dogs. But even if I never forgive him completely, I have forgiven myself. For staying, for being silent, for believing that love meant enduring cruelty, that forgiveness is enough. The neighbors sometimes stop by with their children now. They ask me for advice, call me grandpa. It feels good to be seen that way again, not as a burden but as a person with wisdom. I tell them small things. To be kind, to listen, to never take their parents for granted. I see how their faces soften when I speak, and I pray silently that they never forget those words. Because cruelty doesn't start with fists. It starts with forgetting to care. The dogs still sleep near my porch. They've grown older too, just like me. Every evening I sit with them as the sun sets. I share pieces of my meal, and they sit quietly beside me. The same creatures who once shared my humiliation now share my peace. Sometimes I talk to them, telling them about my day or how I'm feeling. They don't answer, but they listen. In their quiet way, they remind me that loyalty and love don't need blood to be real. There are nights when I dream of my wife. She comes to me the way she used to, smiling, kind, full of warmth. In my dreams, she tells me she's proud of me, that I finally stood up for myself, that I didn't let our son destroy what she and I built with love. When I wake up from those dreams, I feel tears on my face, but they're not from sadness anymore. They're from relief. Relief that I lived long enough to see the end of my pain. I think about my son sometimes, locked away. I wonder if he understands now, if he remembers who I was before anger blinded him. Maybe one day he'll change, maybe not. But that's not mine to fix anymore. My job now is to live, simply, quietly, with dignity. To eat when I'm hungry, to rest when I'm tired, to smile when the sun rises, to be free. When people ask me what I've learned from all this, I tell them the truth. Cruelty from strangers wounds the body, but cruelty from family wounds the soul. Yet even the soul can heal when you stop hiding its pain. So here I am, an old man who was made to eat with dogs, but who now dines in peace at his own table. My final thought: he made me crawl, but I rose. He made me silent, but I spoke. He made me feel small, but I became stronger than he will ever be. And that, I've learned, is what real freedom looks like.